May of 1943, gracing the northern French skies, fighter ace Adolphe Galland piloted his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing arc. His focus was fixed on what he presumed would be an effortless adversary. It was an American aircraft, a notably portly and lumbering machine, navigating the air with the grace of a gestational bovine. Pilots had mockingly dubbed it the legendary milk flasher, or the flying milk bottle, a derisive jest contrasting it with the refined, lethal constructs of the Luftwaffe. Galland expertly positioned for his shot, aiming to augment his already formidable score, boasting in excess of 100 aerial conquests. Then the unimaginable transpired. The American fighter, this supposed unwieldy colossus, abruptly executed an inverted roll and plummeted earthward. This was no desperate plunge born of panic, but a calculated high-velocity maneuver that saw it descend from 25,000 feet to mere meters above the ground in mere moments. Galland attempted to maintain pursuit, urging his 109 into a dive, but within seconds his controls began to stiffen. His aircraft, which had performed with exceptional agility in turning dogfights, became sluggish and unresponsive at such extreme speeds. By the time he executed his pullout from the dive, the American had vanished, utterly gone. Galland returned to his airfield, profoundly unsettled. He had been engaged in combat missions since the Spanish Civil War, had faced the finest the Royal Air Force could muster during the Battle of Britain, and in all those years he had never encountered anything comparable. That very evening Galland meticulously documented his experience in a detailed report. The American P-47 Thunderbolt was far from the laughingstock his pilots believed it to be. It possessed remarkable speed, potentially exceeding the 109 in level flight at higher altitudes. It was equipped with a formidable battery of 8.50 caliber machine guns, capable of shredding a German fighter in mere seconds. And, most disconcertingly, it appeared virtually impervious to damage. Similar reports were emerging from other squadrons, detailing P-47s returning to base having sustained damage that would have utterly destroyed any German aircraft. Galland's conclusion was stark and unequivocal. The P-47 represented a significant peril, necessitating an immediate overhaul of Luftwaffe tactics. German pilots could no longer depend on the aerial supremacy they had enjoyed in the war's nascent years. Engaging the P-47 with conventional dogfighting strategies would prove fatal. He transmitted his report through the chain of command to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe and the second most powerful figure in Nazi Germany. Galland anticipated swift action, directives for revised tactical guidelines, perhaps authorization to expedite the development of new German aircraft to counter this emergent threat. What he received instead was silence, followed a week later by a summons to Göring's headquarters. What ensued was one of the most bizarre and infuriating exchanges of Galland's career, marking the genesis of his transformation from a loyal officer to an internal dissenter, a man who would dedicate the remainder of the war to a desperate endeavor to salvage the Luftwaffe from the pervasive incompetence and delusion of its own leadership. By 1943, Hermann Göring had become a grotesque parody of his former self. Once a distinguished World War I flying ace and an inspiring leader, he had regressed into a vain, corrupt, drug-addled megalomaniac. His ostentatious lifestyle, his obsession with plundering art from occupied territories, and his staunch refusal to entertain any information contradicting his established worldview had rendered him a considerable liability. Yet, as Hitler's oldest and most steadfast lieutenant, his position remained unassailable. Upon Galland's arrival at Göring's sprawling estate, he was subjected to hours of waiting. When the Reichsmarshal finally appeared, he was in a decidedly ill temper. The strategic bombing campaign orchestrated by the Americans and British was escalating. German cities were enduring relentless assaults day and night. Göring, who had famously pledged that not a single enemy bomb would ever strike German soil, was feeling the immense pressure. Galland commenced his briefing, detailing his encounter with the P-47. He presented intelligence communiques from frontline units and outlined the technical specifications as accurately as they could be ascertained: speed, armament, rate of climb, combat radius. Every piece of evidence pointed to an identical conclusion. The P-47 was a formidable adversary, and the Luftwaffe required immediate adaptation. Göring listened intently, his complexion darkening with each successive word. When Galland concluded, a protracted tense silence ensued. Then Göring erupted. "This is defeatist propaganda," he bellowed. "The Americans cannot construct aircraft. They excel at refrigerators and razor blades, but fighters are an impossibility." Galland attempted to interject, to present further evidence, but Göring cut him off. The entire report, he declared, was an American psychological operation designed to demoralize German aviators. The P-47 was a crude, heavy contraption fashioned by a nation of shopkeepers and mongrels. While it might appear intimidating in the hands of Germany's superior pilots, it would be swept from the heavens. Galland, choosing his words with utmost care, pointed out that he himself had engaged the P-47, that he had witnessed its capabilities firsthand, asserting it was not propaganda, but observable reality. This proved to be a misstep. Göring's face contorted from red to a deep purple. "Are you questioning my judgment, young general? Are you suggesting that I, who commanded fighters in the Great War, do not comprehend aerial combat?" Galland recognized he was treading on perilous ground within Hitler's Germany. Contradicting a superior, particularly one as powerful and vindictive as Göring, could be fatal. Nevertheless, he persisted. "Reichsmarshal, I am merely relaying what I have observed. The P-47 represents a grave threat. If we fail to adapt our tactics, we will incur needless losses." Göring waved his hand dismissively. "You worry excessively, Galland. The Luftwaffe is invincible. We possess the finest aircraft, the most skilled pilots, the most effective tactics. These American bombers and their escorts are but transient inconveniences. Once our new jets become operational, we shall sweep them from the sky. Now, I have more pressing matters to attend to." Dismissed. Galland departed the meeting in a state of profound disbelief and simmering rage. He had presented facts, hard data derived from combat operations, only to be dismissed as if he were a hysterical child. Yet Göring's attitude was not an isolated anomaly. It was pervasive throughout the Nazi leadership. The ideology of German racial and technological superiority had erected a cognitive barrier impenetrable to mere facts. The Americans were deemed inferior. Therefore, anything they produced had to be inferior. It was a circular logic, impervious to evidence, and Galland knew with a sinking certainty that this delusion would exact a terrible toll, costing thousands of German lives. In the months following that disastrous encounter, Galland witnessed his direst premonitions materialize. The P-47 Thunderbolts, providing escort for American bomber formations, began to appear in ever-increasing numbers, relentlessly decimating Luftwaffe fighters. The tactics that had proven so effective against the RAF's Spitfires and Hurricanes were proving suicidal against the Thunderbolt. German pilots, schooled in the art of the turning dogfight, would engage the P-47s at medium altitudes. The Americans, adhering to their doctrine of boom and zoom, would eschew direct engagement. Instead, they would ascend to 30,000 feet or higher, where the P-47's supercharged engine granted it overwhelming superiority. From such altitudes, the Thunderbolts would dive upon the German formations with terrifying velocity. The assault would last mere seconds, a high-speed pass, their 8.50 caliber machine guns blazing, followed by the P-47's zoom climb back to altitude before the German pilots could react. Should a German fighter attempt to follow the Thunderbolt into its dive, its controls would stiffen, rendering the aircraft unresponsive at such speeds. By the time it pulled out, the American would have already regained altitude, prepared for another pass. This was a form of combat for which the Luftwaffe had no effective countermeasure. The German fighters, optimized for agility and turning performance, were being systematically annihilated by an opponent who refused to engage on German terms. The attrition rates were catastrophic. During the summer and autumn of 1943, the Luftwaffe was losing pilots and aircraft at a pace exceeding its capacity for replacement. Each week, Galland received reports of experienced pilots shot down, men who had survived years of combat, who had amassed dozens, even hundreds, of kills, were falling victim to American fighters flown by pilots with a fraction of their experience. The decisive factor was the aircraft and the tactics employed. A mediocre pilot in a P-47 executing the boom and zoom doctrine could vanquish an ace in a Bf-109 or an FW-190, provided the German pilot committed the error of engaging on American terms. Galland made repeated attempts to impress upon the high command the gravity of the situation. He authored report after report, presented statistical data, and brought frontline pilots to briefings to articulate their harrowing experiences. The response was invariably consistent: excuses, denial, and accusations of defeatism. Goering insisted the problem lay not with the enemy aircraft, but with the quality of German pilots, whom he claimed were becoming cowardly, unwilling to press their attacks home. He began to question the courage and fighting spirit of the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, the very men who were perishing in droves while attempting to defend German cities from the relentless Allied aerial bombardment. The breaking point arrived during a staff meeting in late 1943. Goering, exasperated by the Luftwaffe's inability to halt the American daylight bombing raids, launched into a furious tirade. He accused the fighter pilots of cowardice and incompetence, claiming they were abandoning the bombers and refusing to engage the enemy. Galland, present at the meeting, along with other senior Luftwaffe officers, finally snapped. He rose to his feet and, in front of the entire assembly, branded Goering a liar. He meticulously detailed the perilous conditions the fighter pilots faced, outnumbered, outgunned, piloting obsolete aircraft against an adversary possessing overwhelming material superiority. The pilots, he avowed, were not cowards, but heroes engaged in an insurmountable battle while their own leadership remained willfully blind. The room fell into a stunned silence. No one had ever addressed Goering in such a manner. Several officers anticipated Galland's immediate arrest. However, Göring, perhaps recognizing that the removal of his most capable fighter commander would constitute a significant public relations disaster, merely glared at Galland and abruptly concluded the meeting. From that moment forward, Galland became a marked man. Göring and his inner circle began seeking any pretext to remove him from command. Yet Galland no longer harbored concerns. He had foreseen the future, a future etched in the contrails of thousands of American bombers and fighters that darkened the skies over Germany. The Luftwaffe was doomed, not for a lack of brave men, but due to leadership by fools and fanatics. In February of 1944, Galland's most dire predictions materialized with devastating impact. The Allies launched Operation Argument, an offensive that would become known as Big Week. It was a coordinated, massive assault targeting the German aircraft industry, designed to secure absolute air superiority in preparation for the planned invasion of France. For 6 consecutive days, successive waves of American B-17 and B-24 bombers, escorted by swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and the new P-51 Mustangs, pounded aircraft factories across Germany and occupied Europe. The Luftwaffe scrambled to defend, committing every available fighter to the fray. This was precisely what the Americans had anticipated. The ensuing combat was apocalyptic. On the very first day alone, the Luftwaffe launched over 200 sorties against the American formations. The German pilots fought with bravery, pressing their attacks with suicidal determination. However, they confronted an enemy they were simply incapable of matching. The P-47s, providing high cover, dove upon the German formations with brutal efficacy. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns unleashed a torrent of lead that shredded the lightly constructed German fighters. A single burst could shear off the wing of a Bf-109. A 2-second burst could set an FW-190 ablaze, and the P-47s themselves seemed extraordinarily resilient. German pilots reported unleashing cannon fire into the substantial American aircraft, observing hits registering, and watching in disbelief as the P-47s absorbed the damage and continued their assault. Galland personally participated in multiple missions during Big Week, leading from the front, as was his custom. On the third day, he engaged a formation of P-47s escorting bombers over Brunswick. His wingman was shot down on the initial pass. Galland himself narrowly avoided death when a Thunderbolt materialized seemingly out of nowhere, its guns tearing through his left wing. He managed to break away and escape, but it was an exceedingly close call. That night, while examining his damaged aircraft, Galland counted over 30.50 caliber bullet holes. Had even a single one of those rounds impacted his fuel tank or the coolant system of his liquid-cooled engine, he would have perished. The realization was sobering. He was among the world's foremost fighter pilots, boasting over 15 years of combat experience, and he had nearly been killed by an American pilot he never even saw approaching. By the conclusion of Big Week, the statistics were devastating for Germany. The Luftwaffe had lost over 350 fighters and nearly 100 bombers. More significantly, they had lost over 250 pilots, many of them seasoned veterans who were irreplaceable. The German aviation industry had sustained a crippling blow. Factories producing fighter aircraft, engines, and components had been destroyed or severely damaged. Recovery would require months that Germany did not possess. In contrast, the Americans had lost approximately 250 bombers and fewer than 30 fighters. And every single one of those losses would be replenished within weeks, thanks to the seemingly limitless production pipeline from American factories. Galland authored yet another report, this one conveying an even greater sense of urgency than his previous warnings. The Luftwaffe, he stated unequivocally, had forfeited the battle for air superiority over Germany. The industrial and material advantage of the Allies, particularly the Americans, was so overwhelming that no amount of tactical brilliance or pilot bravery could overcome it. The P-47, dismissed as a mere jest just a year prior, had now become the dominant fighter over Europe, and Germany was powerless to alter this reality. Göring's response was predictable. He accused Galland of defeatism and ordered the report suppressed. However, by this juncture, even Göring could not entirely disregard the grim reality. The skies above Germany were increasingly obscured by Allied aircraft. German cities lay in ruins. The Luftwaffe was being ground down in a war of attrition it was destined to lose. By the close of 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. The Allies had successfully established a foothold in France. German forces were in retreat on all fronts, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Third Reich, was a mere shadow of its former might. Pilot losses had been so severe that newly recruited pilots were being dispatched to frontline units with rudimentary training. In 1940, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot might have accrued 200 or 300 hours of flight instruction before engaging in combat. By 1944, many possessed fewer than 50 hours. They were being thrust into combat against seasoned Allied pilots flying superior aircraft. It was, as Galland described it, akin to sending lambs to the slaughter. The P-47 Thunderbolt was now a ubiquitous presence in the skies over Germany, joined by even more advanced American fighters, such as the P-51 Mustang, which combined the Thunderbolt's formidable firepower with superior range and speed. German pilots who survived their initial missions quickly learned crucial lessons. Never attempt to turn with American fighters at low altitudes, never try to outclimb them, and never permit them to dictate the terms of engagement. However, for inexperienced pilots, these lessons often arrived too late. The attrition rate for new Luftwaffe pilots was horrific. Certain units were losing 50% of their nascent pilots within the first week of combat. Galland, having been promoted to general of the fighter arm, responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations, found himself in an untenable position. He possessed nominal authority, but lacked genuine power. Göring continuously interfered, issuing conflicting orders and withholding resources crucial for effective operations. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, demanded miraculous weaponry and ultimate victories. Galland was tasked with defending German airspace with a diminishing force of inadequately trained pilots flying aircraft outmatched by the enemy. In November of 1944, Galland undertook an unprecedented action. He orchestrated what became known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt. In conjunction with several other senior fighter commanders, he drafted a letter directly to Göring, demanding fundamental changes. The letter was blunt to the point of insubordination, stating that the current leadership of the Luftwaffe was incompetent, that Göring's refusal to acknowledge reality was costing German lives, and that constant interference from the high command rendered effective operations impossible. It demanded that either Göring resign or grant the fighter commanders the autonomy to manage operations free from political interference. The letter bore the signatures of some of the most decorated and respected fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe, men with hundreds of kills to their credit, men who had risked their lives for Germany countless times. Göring's response was immediate and severe. He branded the signatories as traitors, threatened them with court-martial and execution, and summarily removed Galland from command, effectively ending his operational career. Galland was devastated, but not surprised. He had understood the inherent risks, yet he and his fellow pilots had reached a point where they could no longer remain silent. Too many fine men were perishing due to incompetent leadership. Too many falsehoods were being propagated to the German populace regarding the war's true state. Someone had to speak the truth, even at the cost of career self-destruction. Galland was placed under house arrest, forbidden from flying combat missions. For a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to the art and practice of aerial combat, this felt akin to a death sentence. He remained in his quarters, listening to reports of Allied bombers pummeling German cities, acutely aware that the Luftwaffe was being systematically dismantled, utterly powerless to intervene. In the war's final months, Germany crumbled. The Soviets advanced from the east, while the Americans and British pressed from the west. German cities lay in ruins, the economy was shattered, and the Luftwaffe, or what remained of it, was literally running on fumes. Fuel scarcity was so acute that training flights had been almost entirely suspended. New pilots were being dispatched to combat with virtually no preparation. In a last desperate gamble, Galland was permitted to form an elite unit, Jagdverband 44, equipped with the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. The Me-262, in many respects, represented the aircraft Germany should have possessed 2 years prior. It was exceptionally fast, exceeding 300 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter. It was heavily armed and, in the hands of an experienced pilot, lethally effective. However, it arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. Germany was depleted of fuel, time, and pilots. Galland's unit flew a handful of missions, achieving some success, but it was strategically insignificant. The war was over. Germany had lost, and the Luftwaffe, once the world's preeminent air force, lay annihilated. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Galland, along with thousands of other Luftwaffe personnel, was taken into Allied custody. During his interrogation, American and British intelligence officers questioned him extensively about the war, German tactics, and the leadership of the Luftwaffe. Galland responded with unvarnished honesty. He detailed Göring's incompetence, Hitler's meddling, and the pervasive denial that had characterized German leadership. When specifically asked about the P-47 Thunderbolt, Galland's assessment was unequivocal. It was one of the finest fighters of the war. We completely underestimated it. Our leadership dismissed it as crude American engineering, but it was anything but. It was fast, robust, heavily armed, and produced in numbers we could never match. These aviators were exceptionally skilled and maintained strict discipline. They adeptly utilized the aircraft's advantages while sidestepping its shortcomings. By 1944, encountering a squadron of P-47s meant certain demise for inexperienced German pilots. American officers pressed him. Why did the German command not perceive the danger sooner? Galland's laughter was laced with bitterness. They simply refused to acknowledge the facts. They held an almost religious conviction in German supremacy, dismissing any evidence that challenged this belief as mere fabrication or defeatism. I attempted to caution them multiple times, but within the Third Reich, uttering the truth was considered sedition. When the final reckoning arrived, the numbers unequivocally depicted a complete German collapse in the aerial conflict. The United States had manufactured well over 15,600 P-47 Thunderbolts throughout the war. During its peak production, a new Thunderbolt emerged from the assembly line every single hour. Germany, despite its celebrated engineering prowess, produced approximately 36,000 single-engine fighters in total across all models for the entire duration of the war, and their manufacturing was continually hampered by Allied aerial bombardments. Protected by two vast oceans, the Americans could construct their aircraft without interference. The casualty exchange ratios mirrored this disparity. In 1943, when the P-47 entered widespread combat, German interceptors still achieved a roughly even exchange. However, by 1944, the P-47 was achieving kill ratios of 4-1 or even higher. American pilots were more proficiently trained, flew superior aircraft, and were bolstered by more effective logistical support. The rate of losses for the Luftwaffe pilots became unsustainable. In 1944 alone, Germany sustained casualties exceeding 13,000 aircrew members, encompassing those killed, wounded, or missing. This figure surpassed the entire pre-war fighter force of the Luftwaffe, and these personnel could not be replaced. The pilot training infrastructure had collapsed. Fuel scarcity meant new pilots received minimal flight time. The seasoned aces, individuals like Galland with hundreds of confirmed victories, could not be everywhere simultaneously. They were gradually being worn down in a conflict of attrition that Germany was incapable of winning. The P-47 served as the sharp, steel-tipped vanguard of that campaign. Alongside the P-51 Mustang, it systematically dismantled the Luftwaffe. This was not achieved through a single decisive engagement, but rather through relentless grinding attrition. German cities were reduced to rubble by bombers protected by Thunderbolt escorts. German fighters were shot down by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Germany's industrial capacity, already strained by a two-front war, was systematically dismantled. The P-47 also excelled in ground attack missions, a role it increasingly adopted as the Luftwaffe ceased to pose a significant threat. During the war's final year, P-47s roamed freely across Germany and occupied Europe, destroying railway lines, tanks, trucks, supply depots, and virtually anything that moved. The psychological toll on German troops was immense. The distinctive roar of the P-47's R-2800 engine became synonymous with impending death from above. German soldiers learned to dread clear weather as it signaled the arrival of the Jabos, the fighter bombers, on the hunt. Adolf Galland survived the conflict and lived until 1996. In his later years, he formed friendships with many of his former adversaries, including several American P-47 pilots. He frequented air shows, delivered lectures, and authored numerous accounts of his experiences. When questioned about Germany's most significant errors in the air war, his response was invariably the same: arrogance. We believed we were superior, and that conviction rendered us incapable of seeing reality. The Americans were not expected to be able to construct fighters like the P-47. They were considered a nation of shopkeepers and mechanics, yet they harnessed their industrial genius and engineering expertise to create an aircraft perfectly suited to the type of warfare they needed to wage. And they produced them in quantities we could scarcely comprehend. Gallen's narrative serves as a parallel to that of figures like Admiral Canaris and Albert Speer. These were men who perceived the truth, who grasped the mathematical certainty of Germany's strategic predicament, but who were ensnared within a system where truth was subservient to ideology. Canaris attempted to warn about American industrial might and was disregarded. Speer understood that Germany could not prevail in a production war and remained silent. Galland identified the P-47 as a grave menace and was branded a defeatist. In each of these instances, the Nazi leadership's obstinate refusal to confront reality sealed Germany's doom. The Third Reich was founded upon a bedrock of falsehoods, racial supremacy, ideological purity, and the assuredness of German victory. These were not mere instruments of propaganda. They were articles of faith held with fervent devotion by Hitler and his inner circle. When reality stood in opposition to these tenets, reality itself was discarded. Intelligence reports were ignored. Officers who dared to voice inconvenient truths faced punishment. The entire apparatus was designed to bolster Hitler's delusions, even as the Reich crumbled into ashes. Galland's specific tragedy lies in his patriotism. He cherished Germany and believed in defending his homeland. Yet he possessed the clarity to recognize that Germany's leadership was steering the nation toward ruin, and he was powerless to prevent it. His warnings regarding the P-47 were merely one instance. He also cautioned against the futility of Hitler's offensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. He argued that repurposing the Me-262 jet as a bomber rather than a fighter was strategic folly. Each time his counsel was disregarded or met with reprisal, the narrative of Adolf Galland and the P-47 Thunderbolt stands as a testament to the clash between competence and ideology. Galland was, by all accounts, one of the preeminent fighter pilots and commanders of World War II. He possessed a profound understanding of aerial tactics, aircraft performance, and the strategic landscape. However, he served a regime that prioritized loyalty over capability and ideology over veracity. And that regime met its downfall not due to a deficiency in courage or fighting spirit, but rather because of its own deliberate blindness. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented the tangible embodiment of everything the Nazi leadership refused to accept. It was constructed by a diverse democratic society. Its production facilities employed women, African Americans, and immigrants, precisely the groups that Nazi ideology deemed inferior. And yet, this heterogeneous society manufactured over 15,000 of these fighters. They built them to a high standard, made them robust, and assembled them with remarkable speed. The German response should have entailed immediate adaptation, innovative tactics, new aircraft designs, and updated training protocols. Instead, the reaction was characterized by denial and accusations of cowardice. The Luftwaffe was expected to contend with the American industrial juggernaut using insufficient resources and outdated strategies, all while being assured of inevitable victory if only they possessed sufficient resolve. It was a recipe for disaster, and disaster is precisely what they experienced. Galland attempted to reform the system from within, striving to introduce factual analysis into the decision-making process, and he was suppressed for his efforts. His story serves as a potent reminder that within authoritarian structures, speaking truth is an act of rebellion, and rebellion, however necessary, is met with punishment. If you found this in-depth examination of one of World War II's most crucial yet overlooked narratives compelling, ensure you are subscribed to the channel and activate the notification bell. History is replete with instances where courage manifested as speaking truth to power, even when that truth was unwelcome. Adolf Galland's warnings about the P-47 Thunderbolt were ultimately validated by history. However, by the time the reality could no longer be ignored, it was too late. The lesson remains perpetually relevant. Disregard your adversary's capabilities at your own peril. Dismiss inconvenient truths at your own risk. And never, under any circumstances, conflate propaganda with reality. The P-47 was not anticipated to be a superior fighter. It was considered too heavy, too unrefined, too distinctly American. Nevertheless, it played a pivotal role in defeating the Luftwaffe and securing dominance of the European air war. Ultimately, physics and mathematics are indifferent to ideology, and the Thunderbolt represented the stark reality that shattered the Nazi illusion of invincibility.